exam that we had, did you have time to prepare? Marco? Because I got the impression you did not have enough time.
It's still a bit in a rush.
This is a problem I had to discuss with Professor Ha. We did it well the second year of the program, and people had a lot of time. And then this was reflected in the exam. But in the first year, we didn't do it well. We had an exam close to the lectures, and I think in your class, again, you did not have enough time.
Yeah.
Was it the case because you were doing too many courses at the same time?
In a nutshell, I think we have
Huh?
about 1 week. We had about 1 week without any other kind of like obligation to revise for the course. So I think
So
1
you
week
had
is
1 week to review for my course.
about 1 week. Yes.
But that's not enough.
Yeah, that's not enough.
That's not enough. And we're defeating the purpose because you're not able to learn enough. But how did this happen? Because you had the final. You had the final. Yeah, it was set up before, but you had the other course, Professor Harm's course, I think, as well at the same. No, this came after me.
Yes, correct.
This came after me, but this meant you couldn't review for final review. Huh? Yeah, but there was a leftover another course as well before. Or
Yes.
something. Yeah, but then you don't have. So that's and now you have less than a week for this one. That's so? Because it's on the 20th. Or
Yes. 20 years. The exam is on.
is that enough time? How long do you have? From 10 days. 10 days should be enough. Yeah, but macro is there. And the other thing is, you said you did not understand the point of the course, or something that it wasn't clear, what the purpose of the course was, etc. So I have to try to make it very clear now. Tell me, so in general, if you are getting lost or if you are having, questions like why are we doing this, tell me. Don't wait. Don't be shy. Don't be Vietnamese, polite Vietnamese. Be bold Americans. Be bold Americans and tell me. So that I explain. Okay, let me start also the Zoom. Except they haven't delivered the luggage. So they are coming today, so maybe you call the guards when they bring the luggage. Have to wait It's one suitcase. I think it will arrive before at 11 or something. So then they will bring it at in the afternoon. But when they bring it, they should just take it to apartment 18, leave it in my apartment. Leave it here, yes, it can stay here also for future days. Okay.
Chạy gì dữ vậy em?
Yes, absolutely. And one more thing, can you send me email the pictures for who staff account? Because last time you sent me the password again. What to use for the VGU stuff? I'm using VGU student now.
Sao?
No, I mean,
Em
I
tới
can
đây lúc
keep
10 giờ 27 phút.
but,
Xong mẹ nhắn tới đây là
sometimes-
ủa? Lúc đó 10 giờ 07 anh, mẹ nhắn 10 giờ. Ủa không, đi trễ hả? Quên hả?
You don't
Tới giờ
have
chưa
it.
đi học đó.
You can send me.
Ủa có phải là bình thường không? Gọi đồ. Đâu?
If
Có
there
cái
is
cọc
a
thì là 10
schedule.
bữa xong mẹ nhắn 10 giờ.
Nhưng mà em bị lộn thiệt. Em tưởng 10 giờ thiệt em ơi. Nhưng mà em lỡ hồn vô đây.
Xong cái đi tới cái hành lang cái bà đi đây.
Vô trong lòng em.
Ủa gì vậy?
Yeah.
Bà đi cái đấy nhé.
Because yes,
Mà khổ cái là bà đi cũng thường hay đi trễ, cho nên đâu có tin tưởng.
Xong cái mới tới hàng hóa xong cái bị đụng.
Xong rồi bây giờ nếu tôi là đi thì phải đi trễ 5 phút nữa.
Okay, so we start. Welcome back after some weeks. So this is going to be a different topic now than macro. So it is this area of household finance, which is pretty much as old as my career. So I was, in this area from the very beginning. So we helped. I think I had something to do with the development of the area, and we're going to go through the stuff. So this area was developed by macroeconomists, I'll have you know, but now it gets taught more in finance departments and in some economics departments, but mostly it's in finance departments. And it originated in, by thinking about consumption saving models, and then what would be the next step, and it would be portfolio choice models, that you had, where we had an extra asset to divide savings into between a riskless and a risky asset. And we saw a little bit, in the consumption chapter of the macro course, I introduced you to some of these concepts. I will remind you of those today, but we will go faster than we did back, in the macro course on that, so as to focus on the newer concepts. And if, as I was telling those of you who came early, if you at any point you are wondering why are we doing this, and what's the point of all this, etc., just tell me, ask me. Don't wait for the course review to say I didn't understand the point of this course. It's too late by then. I'm gone, and we cannot redo the course. Okay, as by way of introduction, let me use the syllabus and let me take you through the topics we're going to cover. I am doing it on Zoom, so this may not be necessary. The camera may not be necessary. Because I'm recording it on Zoom, like I did with the macro, of course. So it's not necessary. Sorry, I should have told you. Yeah, it's not necessary. I mean, it's up to you, but I think it doesn't make sense to have two videos there. I don't think they will watch me twice. Once is bad enough. Twice, I don't. Okay, so there is, this course, there is no textbook for this course. Actually, there is one that Sumit Agarwal has published a couple of years ago. It's nice, but it doesn't cover the topics I cover. I mean, there isn't much. There's some overlap, but not a lot of overlap. So, so the syllabus is actually, quite important. Now, here can you see this? So here the most. So this is the Agarwal text, but it's not, as I said, there's some overlap, of course, but it's not perfect overlap. Now, the required text, your reference will be this Journal of Economic Literature paper that I wrote a couple of years ago. Well, now it's 4. Okay. So with Francisco Gomez and Teron Ramatorai. And this review paper references 499 papers, not 500, but 499 papers. So it has, it is quite a detailed reference to a lot that has happened. And you will see that many sections of this, the lectures will be corresponding to those. Now, a volume that got started the whole thing, the whole field, was this volume that we published in 2001 and that I edited with Luigi recently, Appendix Household Portfolios. I believe you may have it here in the library as well. It has also quite a bit of background materials. I told you about the Agarwal textbook. This, I doubt that the library has this. This is edited by Edward Elgar. This is a 3-volume collection of key articles in household finance. So many of the key papers that we cite here are here, but not all. But I doubt that your library bought this because the cost of this, they priced it at more than $1,000 or something like that. And, it is for libraries, but I don't know. But you can, the trick is you, if you want to read a paper, because it will be mostly papers that are referenced, you go to the website of the author or the authors, and normally they will have the text there. And you can try also the electronic website of the journal to see if you have the right to access it. But if you don't, you can go to the author. And maybe they don't have the published version of the article, the fancy version, but they have the very last working paper version, which is basically the same text. Then just for consumption, here is a very, very nice book, The Economics of Consumption, Theory and Evidence, again for reference. For debt, consumer credit, this is the first volume that came out on consumer credit issues back in 2006 from MIT Press. And my chapter on credit cards is there with Carol Bertot. but also other interesting chapters on that issues. So that might be another reference thing. This is for analytical theory, so you will see, and I think we had mentioned, that most of the models, the theoretical models in cultural finance are computational models, so they are solved with computational methods because analytical methods don't exist. But actually, Christian Gollier, back in 2001, has written a very nice book on the economics of risk and time, and he's an analytical theorist. So here, you go pretty much as far as you can without touching the computer and solving things by hand. But the concepts, the way he discusses, introduces concepts, etc., can make it another reference book. These Campbell and Visea books, Strategic Asset Allocation, Portfolio Choice for Long-Term Investors, this uses linearization. They linearize the model to be able to solve it analytically, and they make some headway in that respect. This thing on financial innovation, this is really this is on the work of Bob Shiller, Robert Shiller, subsequent Nobel laureate. So it is on whether we had too much or too little financial innovation in the financial crisis or leading up to the financial crisis. So it is more specialized. But it is a book that has done extremely well. MIT Press sold many copies of this book, and it is either because I edited it, or because Bob Shiller got the Nobel Prize a few years after I edited it, and you can have your pick as to what is the more likely explanation for that. But it has some interesting stuff in it on financial innovation. And then this stock holding in Europe, this is focused on stock holding, this book with Riso and Giapelli, and there you can see also, but you can see it on SSRM, you can see a background paper I wrote on stock market participation, how much do we know, etc. At that time, and it goes through primarily the theory aspect, but there are also other interesting papers. Okay, so how are we going to structure this? What are the topics we're going to look at? So I'll start today with a background sort of chapter, if you like, or a lecture on properties of assets and household risk preferences, just to make sure we are all on the same page, and because you guys told me you didn't have a lot of time to prepare for the macro exam, maybe you didn't have a lot of time for the consumption chapter either. So I'm going to go through, review some of the material I have already told you, but that's about the last place, actually, here and also in the stock market participation and life cycle portfolio models. So these, you will see some of the stuff I've said before, but also will continue beyond that. Okay, so what is the puzzle here? I had mentioned it in macro. It is that the standard model predicts that everybody should be investing at least epsilon in stocks, but there is no country in the world where all households participate in the stock market, and maybe Sweden is the most developed in this sense, and about 70% of households participate in the stock market. So the model, and it's about 50, maybe about 60% in Norway and about 50% in the US, and pretty much every other country, the majority fails to be consistent with the model, right? So you have a situation where the majority of people don't behave like the model suggests. So we are going, I sort of described this or showed you this in the macro consumption lecture, here we are going to go on and see, okay, what solutions have we got for this? You know, what solutions have been proposed? And we'll see a range of solutions. And I'm going to talk also, I haven't put it so much in the lectures, but or even in the references here, but you know, I'm going to talk about the paper we are just producing. I mean, you know, on my flight here, or right before my flight here, we sent it off to a journal. So, and it has novel implications. I'm going to tell you a bit about this as well. And you can download it from my website, I can tell you. Okay, then we go to international comparisons. So we now have lots of household level data sets across countries. So we can, first of all, figure out and compute wealth and net wealth holdings in different countries. And we can also know the participation rates in different types of assets and debts. And we also know the conditional amounts. So conditional on participation, how much do you hold in one or the other asset or debt, right? So then we can compare it across countries, right? And when you make this comparison, you will see here, you know, this paper that we published in 2013, I mean, we were done with it in 2011. It showed up in the journal in 2013. I mean, it had been accepted in 2011. This is something for your future. It takes forever to publish a paper in economics. So you have to be prepared for that. But the previous paper, comparative paper to ours, was comparing 3 countries. We were able to compare 11 or 12 different countries in this paper. And the problem with that is that when you put all the numbers of the different countries next to each other, then, okay, they look different, okay, but what more can you say? Can you say anything more, right? They're different, but can you say anything more? And I'm going to go through a method, you know, of comparing, you know, when you go across countries, and suppose you look at stock market participation, or suppose you look at the amounts that people put in stocks or in their house, or whether they participate in mortgages, etc. One potential source of differences across countries is the composition of the population, right? So one country may have older people than the other country. And the older tend to be, you know, especially the older while they are working, during their working life, they are more likely to be participating in the stock market than younger people. So maybe part of the difference is because of the composition of characteristics in the population. And another part has actually 2 components. One is how people of a given demographic composition and composition of characteristics, how do they behave with respect to participation in different assets and debts, and with respect to amounts, you know, how much do they hold for given characteristics, okay? And now this second part is partly due to policies and institutions in the country. So as you go across countries, part of the difference in this conditional behavior conditional characteristics can be due to differences in policies and institutions. But there may be also another part which is due to cultural differences, right? So maybe, you know, Vietnamese culture is very different from, you know, US culture, and that shows up in the financial behavior of households. So unfortunately, when you are comparing across countries, you can't decompose policies and institutions from culture, okay? So the next topic, it's just a black box. It's either the characteristics or policies, institutions, and culture together. And then we come to the next topic, which is cultural and hereditary influences on financial behavior. Can we sort of estimate those? Can we show those in the data? And the approach that people have used in this is to not consider different countries, but to consider one country, right? Focus the attention on one country, but then look at natives of the country and immigrants in that country, which come from different other countries, okay? So you have people in the US, or people in Sweden that we have used, or people in Canada. I mean, there are different papers using different data sets, and they are immigrants to that particular country, and we can observe where they came from, right? So then we observe their characteristics, so we can control for the characteristics, decompose the difference into those characteristics. And we observe their cultural heritage, okay? So if they have differences from other immigrants of different cultural heritage, or from the natives, the people who are Swedes and live in Sweden, or the Americans who live, of course, most Americans are immigrants at some point or another, but, they are not recent immigrants. They have really been there for some centuries, or, they consider themselves as native Americans. So you compare the immigrants between them, and you compare them with the natives. You control for their characteristics, and they're in the same country, so they are facing the same policies and institutions, okay? So the differences must be coming from culture, or are very likely to be due to cultural differences, okay? So, 3 components: cultural characteristics, policies and institutions of the country, and culture, right? So in section 3, we compare across countries, so we can take out characteristics, decompose characteristics, and all the other things taken together. In section 4, we look at immigrants, we look at just one country, so we are fixing the policies and institutions, and we are looking at immigrants from different places and natives, so we can control for characteristics, and then the differences are likely to be due to cultural differences. Okay, so that's the approach, and we'll see what has come out of that. And we'll also talk a little bit about, you see some references here about nature versus nurture, sort of innate hereditary characteristics versus the environment. Then, we go to section 5, saving and portfolios of the rich. And, the key reference here, Chris Carroll, this chapter is actually in the Household Portfolios book that I edited. You see here in Household Portfolios that back in 2001, and it continues to be a very interesting chapter because he proposed a particular model there on bequest that can help explain bequest behavior. So the idea, you may say, why do we care about the rich? We care about the rich because they have a lot of wealth, right? And they can make a difference, when they invest. But the rich are not blown up versions of the poor. So it's not like we take a poor household, or more generally a non-rich household, a household that has limited wealth. It's not the case that they participate in a wide range of assets, and then we just multiply their income, by 100 or by 50 or by 1,000, and we get Bill Gates, right? That's not what's going on in the data. What we find is that Bill Gates not only has a lot of wealth, but participates in a very wide range of assets, right, and debts. Whereas the low wealth people participate in a very limited range of assets. So you are not getting Bill Gates by multiplying a low wealth person by some constant, right? Now, you may say, okay, my grandmother knows this. Why are you stressing this so much? Well, because the standard model, consumption saving portfolio choice model that we have, also has that implication, and I will come back to it. The standard model that we have is a homothetic model, which means that it determines the ratio of stocks to income, and it says that's what we are solving for, right? The fraction of income that goes into stocks, or the fraction of permanent income that goes into stocks. And this has the implication that I'm going now to multiply by 1 million, and I'm going to get the permanent income of Bill Gates. So Bill Gates should have exactly 1 million the stocks of a poor person. But that's the implication of the homothetic model, which is the most standard model, but that's not what we see in the data. And we're going to try to understand theoretically, as well, where these differences are coming from, right? Then there is the issue of how people behave when they do participate in stocks, in the stock market. And here, historically, there have been two literatures. One literature in finance, coming from finance, and one literature coming more from economists. And they have been looking at two different types of data sets, two different types of data. So the literature in finance has been looking at brokerage data from a brokerage. In the US, but also in other countries, up until very recently, now you can do things on apps, trading apps, etc. But before the invention of these apps, in order to trade in the stock market, to buy and sell stocks, you had to have a brokerage account, okay? And these people, these two researchers, Barber and O'Dean, managed to get brokerage account data, very detailed brokerage account data, from a discount broker. A broker that was not offering advice, was just giving you the chance to buy and sell stocks, right? And they found that trading is hazardous to your wealth. Look at those fantastic titles. Smoking is hazardous to your health. Do you have this here in Vietnam? Do they have to stamp this?
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
Yes, they do, but nobody
Pay attention,
Yes. So they say trading is hazardous to your wealth, because what they found was, from that data set, was that people typically overtrade. They push the button too many times, and every time they trade, they are paying a transactions cost. So they are not able to beat the market. It's not like they are able to do very well. So compared to other people who were not trading, they are losing wealth, right? They are doing worse. It's better to buy and hold than to, keep going like this. So that was the point of that paper. And then they looked at men versus women, and they wrote the other paper, boys will be boys, right? Gender overconfidence and common stock investment. So what they found was that it is mostly men who behave like this. So it was mostly men who were pushing the button, right? And women were actually doing better because they were not over-trading. And their explanation for this over-trading was overconfidence. Okay? So the conclusion from the finance literature was households overtrade in the stock market. Right? But then there was this other literature coming from economics that I mentioned. And in that literature was not looking at brokerage account data, but it was looking at retirement account data, okay? So these were individual retirement accounts. So people, can you open a pension account in Vietnam, a private pension account that you are putting some money in every month, whatever you like, and then when you come to retire, there's an amount there, it gets invested, maybe there's an amount there, and that gives you a pension for life. Is that something you can do?
Private pension, we're not sure. Public
Not
pension.
pension, but you can get the amount. Huh? You can get the amount at age 65 or something.
Yeah,
Huh?
I think so.
This is for, well, you guys find out, because once you get a job, you should start doing this right at the beginning. That's a big message I want to give you, even with little money at the beginning. If you have many years ahead of you, I mean, this interest compounds and you accumulate a lot. Anyway, so, but in the US what happens is, and in some other countries, you are putting money in, you open a retirement account, so you put some money every month. You are putting some money every month. You cannot costlessly take out this money. I mean, it is a retirement account. So the country gives you a tax incentive to do that. So they are not taxing you for the money that you're putting in that account. They're going to tax you when you get the pension. So you can also choose how much to put in stocks, how much to put in a riskless asset, fund, whatever. So there are different mutual funds. And money accumulates, and then your retirement age comes, and an amount of money has been accumulated there, right? Invested in these mutual fund effectively. And then this money is used to buy an annuity. Does anybody, do you know what annuities are? So, yeah, you buy this annuity and you give all this money and buy annuities, and then you get a pension for life, right? And if you die early, then, the annuity company benefits, of course. But they are not going to come and kill you for that. Okay. But they benefit that, they are pooling the risks, basically, the longevity risks. Some people live very long, others don't, and with these annuities, they are pooling the risks. So this is a retirement account. And then the question is, people are putting stocks in the US, for sure, they are putting stocks in that retirement account. Are they over trading those stocks as well? Because yes, you cannot take the money out, right? There are really restrictions in taking the money out prematurely. But what you can do is you can shift money in your account from stocks to the riskless asset and back and forth as much as you want, right? And you can also change the future allocations as much as you want. You can say, yeah, now I have 30% stocks, 70% riskless, but the next allocation you put 50-50, and you know, after 2 months you put 70-30 or something like that. So you can pretty much costlessly change the allocation. So the question is, are people doing this a lot, which would mean buying and selling stocks a lot, right, or not? And the economics literature that I'm referring to found that people are pretty much dead when it comes to retirement accounts. So they don't touch them. They touch them very infrequently, okay? So now we have a puzzle, right? It's stocks in the brokerage accounts and stocks in the retirement accounts, right? And the finance literature is telling us households overtrade stocks, and the economics literature is telling us households don't touch the stocks at all. So what on earth is going on? So we're going to find out. I'm just building up suspense. We're going to find out when we get there, you know, what the situation is. And interestingly, this new paper that I haven't put up yet on your reading list, that I think I put now since we sent it off, is touching upon this as well, but with a twist that we have not anticipated before. Okay. Then the next topic is your peers, right? Your buddies. Do they influence your behavior, your financial behavior? Okay? And do they influence your financial behavior in a positive or in a negative way, etc.? And here the issue poses econometric challenges. So really the basic challenge here is not sort of theoretical, but it's really econometric. So suppose that I look at your portfolios, right? Or suppose I look, you know, maybe you're students now, you don't have much of a portfolio, but you know, I look at your portfolios 10 years after you start working, where you have some assets, you have some wealth and all of this, and I find out that your behavior is similar, right? You're behaving in a similar way. Now, finding out that your portfolio is very similar to your peers' portfolio is not a proof that you have been influenced by your peers in your portfolio choice, right? Because, for example, you choose your peers, you choose who your buddies are, and that we know that there is a great tendency for people to choose peers who are like them. So it's a Greek word, homophily. Homophily means you like people who are like you, who are similar to you, right? Homophily. So maybe you have similar portfolios because your preferences are very similar. And your preferences are very similar because you chose your peers to be very similar to you, right? So it's not that you were influenced by your peers. They didn't tell you invest in stocks, but you like taking risks and you have picked your peers because they also are fun people like this or risk-taking people like this. And both you and your peers are holding stocks, but not because you were influenced by your peers. So that's common preferences is a big problem that one has to deal with. And the other big problem here, to establish peer effects, and the other big problem here is common environment, common preferences and common environment. So maybe I find that you and your neighbors are investing in the same types of mutual funds or are investing in the, you know, are getting similar types of loans, mortgages, whatever. But maybe you are all responding to the same banks that are there, right? So So you live in a neighborhood and there is one bank or two banks, and everybody goes to those banks. So they are holding similar portfolios, not because they were influenced by their peers, but because they are influenced by the common environment that they have. And you can generalize. Maybe you say, okay, now there is internet, there is so much information, but you can generalize also to your occupational environment. So you find that people in the same office are holding similar accounts. Is it because one talked to the other, or is it because they are facing common prospects in their jobs, right? They have similar incomes, they have similar unemployment probabilities, they have similar promotion probabilities and things like that. So common preferences and common shocks, common preferences and common environment or common shocks. You know, sometimes we talk about common shocks, other times we talk about common environment, but the idea is similar, have to be ruled out, have to be controlled for us to be finding peer effects. And what we are going to see here is a set of papers that are finding clever ways to do this, control for common preferences and common shocks, and really identify peer effects. Right? That's the difficult part here. Then we go to a big topic and a very popular topic, and a topic that's policy relevant for all countries, and certainly I have no doubt that it is very policy relevant for Vietnam as well. You know, maybe also for the additional reason that you are in some sort of transition from, you know, a more communist environment to a more open environment. And that's the topic of financial literacy and investment mistakes. So what's going on here? The literature started exactly 20 years ago, in 2005, with, you know, very important work, seminal work by Anna Maria Lusaldi and Olivia Mitchell. And what they established was, you know, they surveyed Americans. And they surveyed Americans that were 60 to 65 years old, or 55 to 60, something like that. So these were not spring chickens, right? I mean, these were not young people just starting, you know, their career and not having any experience. But these were, you know, older and experienced people in the financial market. And they asked them 3 questions. I mean, you know, initially the questions varied a little bit, but now they have stabilized to the big 3 questions of financial literacy. So one was a question about, I will actually talk to you about the very initial questions, and it's even more depressing than what I'm going to tell you now. But the standard questions nowadays are first a question on interest compounding. So do people understand that interest compounds? If you leave money in the bank, you know, at some positive interest rate, that then it gets compounded and compounded and compounded, and then it accumulates to a big amount. So one question on interest compounding. A second question on the difference between real and nominal interest rates, right? So basically, do people understand the effect of inflation on the interest that you're getting, the interest rate that you're getting? Do they know to compute the real interest rate and focus on that or not? And then the third question of the big 3 financial literacy questions is on diversification. So they ask them, is an individual stock riskier than a whole combination, you know, mutual fund that has lots of stocks, right? And many people, this is the question that is done worst compared to the others, but many people think that if you're holding many stocks, then it's riskier, you're taking more risks. They don't understand that these stocks can be diversified, that you can reduce your overall risk and still maintain the same expected return by holding a variety of stocks. Okay, so they found that Americans were pitiful in terms of performance in this test, right? And then some other people in other countries said, oh, Americans don't know anything, and blah, blah, blah. And then they did these tests in their own countries, and now we know that everybody is pitiful, right? There is widespread financial illiteracy. And you may say, okay, Vietnam is a transition sort of state, and people haven't had a lot of experience. But even if you go to the richer, financially developed countries, the members of the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, you find widespread financial illiteracy there, right? And OECD is actually one of the pioneering institutions in financial literacy programs. Okay, so point number one, there is widespread financial illiteracy. We all know this now, it has been established. Point number two, does it matter, right? Okay, so that's a more difficult point. Because you see, I don't know how my car works, right? But I can still drive it. So does it matter that I don't know how my car works, right? Maybe yes, maybe no. So a second class of papers found, looked at the data again, did these regressions, micro household level data regressions, and they established that there is a positive correlation between higher financial literacy and good financial outcomes. So for example, just to give you one example, but I'll give you many more when we come to that, people who are more financially literate are also much more likely to save for retirement, right? So they are going to be prepared for retirement. People who are more financially literate are more likely to participate in the stock market, okay? To have lower debts. So there are lots of very positive financial outcomes that have been correlated to financial literacy. Okay. How useful is this? Well, it's not very useful. I mean, it's kind of interesting to note, but it's still not useful for policy purposes, right? Because maybe I'm just a smart person overall, right? And because I'm a smart person, I am more likely to be financially literate, to have educated myself to find out about interest compounding and real and nominal interest rates and diversification. And because I'm smart, I realize that, retirement is a difficult period, so you have to have enough for retirement. So I'm also more likely to be saving for retirement. You see what I mean? But this is unobserved heterogeneity. It's not causality, right? So there is a hidden, I observe a positive correlation between financial literacy and probability to save for retirement, but it is not causal. It doesn't follow that a more financially literate person, because they're more financially literate, will be more likely to save for retirement. There is a hidden underlying factor, which is how smart they are, right? And that determines both the financial literacy and the saving for retirement. So this is unobserved heterogeneity. There's a factor you're not controlling for, which is determining both. And it's making you think that people are saving for retirement, more likely to save for retirement, because they are financially literate. So you have to take care of that, or this is unobserved heterogeneity, or there is reverse causality. So people are saving for retirement, some people are saving for retirement? Because they are, why? Because, they are getting older and they realize this, because somebody told them, I don't know, they got good advice, for some, whatever exogenous reason. And then once they started saving for retirement, they had to find out about interest compounding, about inflation, about where to invest, the mutual funds versus individual stocks and all of that. So they became financially literate because of that. You see what I mean? So that's reverse causality. An exogenous reason is making you save for retirement, and that is making you become financially literate. So if I come with my financial literacy programs to boost your financial literacy, I'm not going to boost your saving for retirement. That was determined by something else, right? Not by your financial literacy. So this is the kind of questions. So there is this third level of the literature then that's causal, tries to be causal. So it tries to find instruments, for example, for financial literacy that can be inserted in the estimation, instrumental variable estimation, to find, causal effects on outcomes, on good outcomes. And then if you are finding this, if you are finding a causal effect of financial literacy on good financial outcomes, and you want to promote financial literacy, how do you do it? So that's the fourth level of the literature. Do we have examples of financial education programs that have been evaluated and have been shown to produce good results, right? To produce positive results on good outcomes, on financial literacy, and through that on better outcomes. So these are the four levels of the financial literacy literature, and I'm going to talk to you about some examples of that. And then we go to financial advice, and here I come back to my inability to understand how my car works, right? I told you I can still drive it, so I don't have to learn. Okay, so that's relevant for financial literacy. But why am I able to drive my car and I don't have to worry? Because there is a good mechanic, a car mechanic, who knows how my car works. And whenever my car breaks down, I can take it to that mechanic, right? So here is financial advice, financial advisors. So some of you, maybe many of you, will become financial advisors in the future, right? Because you will enter that industry, the financial advice industry. And now I'm learning from Professor Ha as well that the government has decided to make Ho Chi Minh City a financial center. You came to the conference that there was, etc. And that is now serious. And BGU is becoming a training center for, the financial industry in Vietnam. That's, for the Ho Chi Minh. So that sounds fantastic, right? Very promising. So can we rely on financial advice so that people don't need to know anything? There is a trusted financial advisor, and the financial advisor will tell them, right, how to allocate their portfolio, how to invest. And the news here is not very good, okay, in terms of the existing literature and the data sets, from a number of financially advanced countries. Controlling for your character. We had an early paper in this literature, and we found that controlling for your characteristics, for household characteristics, having a financial advisor is actually detrimental for your portfolio outcomes. So you get a lower, ratio of expected return to risk, right, to standard deviation. a lower Sharpe ratio, and you are getting worse performance in your portfolios because you have a financial advisor compared to a situation where you were doing things on your own. And then there are other studies that say, okay, are financial advisors more knowledgeable, right? Do they know something? Are they knowledgeable? Can they advise people? And that's very limited as well, because not every financial advisor has gone through a master's program in finance. I mean, many are just there out of chance with very limited knowledge, etc. And then you may say, and then there is a lot of emphasis. So that is on knowledge, but then there is also emphasis on incentives. How are they getting paid, right? So many financial advisors are giving you advice and they are selling you products at the same time. So if I'm selling this product, I'm going to be telling you, oh, this is excellent, you need this, you absolutely, how can you go through life without this? And then I'm cashing in on you because I convinced you. But that's a conflict of interest, right? So how do we deal with conflict of interest? And then there's a beautiful paper here of people following financial misconduct, financial scams in the US. And what happened to the financial advisors that gave you wrong advice and really, just to make more money. They really misled you. They got you to buy a bad product. And the finding is maybe, they are likely to lose their job, but they are not likely to disappear from the market. They are going to get another job in a company, in a financial advice company that has people like them. So they has more crooks like them. So they don't disappear from the market. They're just going somewhere else where they can continue scamming people. So the issue of figuring out the effects of financial advice and what we can do about them and what the market, because in financing, your finance courses, you talk about noise trading and things like that, and one standard result is that noise traders tend to lose money and get out of the market, and they're wiped out and I don't know what. But here, the financial advisors that engage in misconduct, they don't disappear from the market. So we have a problem, right? So we have a bigger problem. We have to try to understand that. Okay, and then, another topic is credit card borrowing. And this is, the big issue here is the so-called co-holding puzzle. And, I had written with Carol Berthaud a paper that appeared in this 2006 volume on this puzzle, and also an academic paper, a journal paper that appeared in 2009. And we thought this would be over and people would not be talking about it anymore, this co-holding puzzle that I'm going to describe. But it turns out, I was at our group's network conference 3 weeks ago in Copenhagen, in Denmark, and one of the papers was on the co-holding puzzle. So it continues to be a paper, it continues to be a puzzle that attracts attention. So what is it? So you have a significant share of people in the US, but also not only in the US, who are revolving credit card debt, so who are borrowing on the credit card and paying interest rates of the order of 14, 16, 18% on the credit card. And at the same time, they have money in the bank and they are earning a zero interest rate or some 0.00001% interest on that. And they could have taken this money and paid off the credit card and saved the 18% interest rate. right? But they are not doing it. So they are keeping money in low interest accounts, and they are paying tons of money in high interest debt, and they are not using this money to pay off this debt. Okay? So one issue is how widespread is this, and another issue is how can we understand this, how can we explain this in our models, in our theory, right? Because finance would tell you there's an arbitrage opportunity here, right? You can costlessly reduce your interest costs, right? You can take money from one account, put it in another, and costlessly, but also risklessly. That's the important thing. Without risk, you can take some money out and put, off the bank account, put it in the credit card account and lower your interest costs. Why are you not doing it? Okay, and there are some interesting ideas that have to do with self-control issues, more psychological issues, have to do with future borrowing constraints, have to do maybe with mechanical issues that you have to pay your taxes in cash and you cannot charge your taxes on a credit card and things like that. We're going to go through that. And that's how much I plan. Now, there is one thing I can do. I will see how it goes, how excited you are, what you prefer, or how depressed you are. I hope you're not depressed. I have a brand new lecture, if you like, on environmental issues, on environmental effects on household finances. So the effects of climate change on the finances of the household. And I could go through that. We'll see how much time we have. I could replace one of these topics with that, but I don't know. Is climate change a big thing in Vietnam? Are you concerned? I see a lot of plastic. You're not so concerned about the environment as you should be. I see a lot of plastic, but so maybe we progress, and maybe I ask you and you choose whether you want to do, say, for example, credit cards or the environment. Okay, makes sense.
Yep.
Are you reasonably excited, interested, or are you saying, oh, yet another course we have to take? I saw on the list now, this course is mandatory elective, required elective. How can you have a mandatory elective?
Elective
It's an elective, right? You must be able to choose, but to have to choose it, yeah, I think that's pretty, a little bit contradictory. Okay, so let me share this first background lecture. When we get started with that. Okay, so background. Oops, it didn't do it. Trying to do two things here. It doesn't like. become it has become more complicated to mirror this here. Zoom interferes with how are we going to do this? You can stop. Maybe just stop. Doesn't mirror here. So can you? It seems that Zoom just interferes with us. So I mean, one way is for you to go through Zoom, but it's a little ridiculous. So let me do another thing. Let me just stop. Let me just stop Zoom. And reading for all, and then it would be two. Now it shows me. I mean, you know, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Window or up. Okay. Yes. Okay. So now let me start another Zoom. Okay. Yes, we're in business. I should start recording. Okay, so background materials. So properties of assets, we know about expected return, and we know that expected return includes whatever income you get in a particular period. It could be a coupon payment, it could be an interest payment, it could be a dividend, and it also includes capital gains, expected capital gains or losses. So expected return, and then we have risk, and you have the idiosyncratic risk, the variance of the return, but our models stress very much the correlation of the return with a relevant object. So the contribution of a particular asset to the riskiness of what we care about. So in standard CAPM, it is the, so now, sorry, I have to interrupt because it's my back. Hello? Hello? Yes. Yes. Very good. I have given you the address, right? Vietnamese German University. So I am teaching. I'm not in the room, but what they can do is bring it to the guard there at the entrance. You have the address, and tell them to take it to apartment 18. Right? Yeah, Vietnamese German University, in the faculty apartment. Yeah, all of this, yes. But there, to take it to faculty apartment 18 and leave it in the room. What time? Yes. Okay, very good. But please do that. Don't try to call me again because I may be teaching at the same time. So just tell the driver to ask the guard to take it to my apartment. Okay? Right. Yeah, don't call me. Just tell the guard to take it to the apartment because I am in class. I cannot interrupt. I interrupted now, but I cannot interrupt again. So, just tell the driver to ask the guard to bring it to my apartment. This apartment 18, faculty apartment 18, at Fiji. Yes? Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye. They love to talk. This phone call cost me €8 now, because if I answer the phone, it costs €8. So, but on top of that, they want to keep calling me, not during class. Yeah, okay. Sorry guys, but as you can understand, I had to say it 3 times, and I have written it to them as well. Emailed them, and they just don't. Okay. Okay, so risk, and we emphasize the correlation. Liquidity, how liquid an asset is how easily it can be converted to a form that we can use to buy things, right? To a liquid form. And housing, for example, is an illiquid asset because it takes time for us to sell a house, right? If we need cash the next day for whatever cash the next day, unless you are willing to take a huge price cut, right? So there are less liquid and more liquid assets, and here individual stocks, mutual funds are totally liquid. You can get your money, certainly by the next day. But retirement accounts that I was talking about are much less liquid because you're not allowed to withdraw funds. And the house is, the least liquid of the two. Then there is this concept of reversibility. So my advisor, Jim Tobin, liked that concept, but I don't see it anymore. I don't see it as a term coming up, but of course the idea is there and it is important. So it is the value to a buyer as a ratio of the value to a seller. So how much, if I'm going to buy a house, how much do I pay relative to how much the seller receives? Because the seller has to pay, transactions fees, right? And receives the rest. So what is or sometimes I, as the buyer, have to pay the transaction fee, and then the seller receives the rest. So what is the size of transactions costs and other administrative costs? There can be a tax also. It can be a transfer of property tax that also has to be paid, etc. So it captures the institutional constraints, if you like, the costs imposed by the institutional constraints in a transaction, in a transaction like this. That's relevant for household finance. And then finally, there is this service yield, the aspect of the service yield. And this is typically the difference between financial assets and real assets. So financial assets are, deposits, bank deposits, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, retirement accounts, etc. And a real asset is a house, is a private business, the value of a private business, land, real estate, any type of real estate, and any type of private business is that you maybe own wholly or a share of, right? Maybe you have a partner in your private business. That these are real assets, and nobody has been framing their dollars or their dong or whatever to decorate the living room, right? Their only value is in facilitating, making it possible for you to buy something in the future, right? So financial assets don't have a service yield, but real assets like a house, you have the house because you are hoping it will appreciate in value, right? The price of the house. So that is a reason, and that enters your budget constraint. The house enters your budget constraint. But you also have a house because you are enjoying the services of the house. I mean, you enjoy living in the house. You get housing services, and that's a service yield of the house, which is in addition to any financial return that you get from the house. And that you would put typically in the utility function. So you would put consumption in the utility function, comma, housing services, maybe also leisure, depending on the model, but you would also put housing services in the utility function. And then your housing investment enters the budget constraint and enters your preferences as well, right? So that's the service yield, and it's an extra aspect. Okay, risk aversion, you all know. Okay, so this is consumption and this is utility of consumption, and we are assuming, concave utility. And if you get the consumption for sure, this is your utility from getting C bar for sure. But if I introduce this mean preserving spread, so with probability 1/2 you're getting minus epsilon 1, with probability 1/2 you're getting plus epsilon 1. Can we turn this off because it's giving me, I don't know, it's giving me a cold. Too much. So the expected value of what you're getting, the expected value of what you're getting is still C bar, but because now I have introduced risk, your expected utility is only up to here, and the fact that this expected utility is below the utility from a certain outcome means that you are risk averse, okay? And we measure the risk aversion by the concavity, the second derivative of the utility function, and normalized by the first derivative, okay? Now, you all know this. I'm putting it up to contrast it with prudence that you may remember from the macro course as well, and I'm going to introduce it again quickly to remind you. And the important thing here is that this is the utility function, whereas with prudence, we will be looking at the marginal utility function, not the utility function, okay? So we will be going one derivative up. Now, why don't we just use U double prime to measure risk aversion? Well, because we want our utility function to satisfy this affine transformation property, right? Affine transformation property that if my preferences are represented by U of C, then they should also be represented by V of C, where A is positive and B is another constant, whatever constant it is. So this is what's called an affine transformation, and my preferences should be invariant with respect to affine transformations. I should not be getting different predictions from using V of C compared to the predictions I'm getting from using U of C. And if I were to use the second derivative of U to describe risk aversion, or if you like, and the second derivative of V, look at what is going on. The second derivative of V is A times the second derivative of V. So I am, through this affine transformation, I'm boosting risk aversion, right? Or, maybe I'm manipulating risk aversion. I'm multiplying it by this alpha, or A, which could be, bigger than 1, less than 1, whatever. I'm manipulating it. It's not invariant. My risk aversion is not invariant with respect to affine transformation. But if I normalize by the first derivative of the utility function, V prime of C is A U prime of C, right? So V double prime divided by V prime would be A U double prime divided by A U prime, right? And then you are getting the A's cancel out, and you are getting the same risk aversion. So V double prime divided by V prime, with a minus sign in front, is equal to minus U double prime divided by U prime. Okay? So it's invariant. So that's why we normalize that. So here is absolute risk aversion, and here is relative risk aversion. And for the relative risk aversion, we take absolute risk aversion, we multiply by the argument, which is consumption. And again, it is invariant to this affine transformation. Now, how do we interpret these two measures in terms of a portfolio model? of a portfolio choice model, well, somebody with constant, if we have a portfolio choice model with constant absolute risk aversion, right? That means that as wealth goes up, the amount invested in the risky asset is constant. So with constant absolute risk aversion, me and Bill Gates, we both hold 1,000 euro in stocks or dollars in stock, right? Doesn't matter how rich the person is. With constant absolute risk aversion, so that's ridiculous as an implication at the top. We use constant absolute risk aversion for other reasons, not because of their of this property, which is ridiculous. But with constant relative risk aversion, if you write down a portfolio model and you increase the amount of wealth, then what you're getting is a constant risky portfolio share. Okay? So if me and Bill Gates are characterized by the same constant relative risk aversion utility function, then he will have, I don't know, 50%, 40% of his wealth in stocks, and I will also have 50% of my wealth in stocks. Is this ideal? It's not ideal, because in the data we're finding that the wealthy are having bigger shares in stocks, right? Bigger risky portfolio shares. But it's certainly, it has a better fighting chance of being reasonable or approximating at least some part of the data compared to the constant absolute risk aversion, that we all have the same amount in stocks. Okay, very good. So this is now 12, right? So we can pause the recording here and